Northern France, late spring 1944. From the observation posts ringing the Luftwaffe airfields and the flak towers guarding industrial complexes, the distant high-altitude contrails were at first dismissed as an annoyance, a persistent but ultimately harmless feature of the upper atmosphere. These faint streaks, often appearing just after 0800 hours as the morning haze burned off, represented the American bomber streams, their targets usually far to the east, deep within Germany. The stakes were clear. Any resource diverted to engage these distant specks was a resource unavailable for more immediate threats, or for the defense of the Reich itself. Oberlieutenant Klaus Richter, a veteran flak battery commander with experience from the Polish and French campaigns, had long instructed his crews to conserve ammunition. His 8.8-centimeter flak 36 guns, formidable against medium-altitude targets, were largely ineffective at the extreme operational ceilings of the B-17s and B-24s. He viewed the distant formations through his Zeiss binoculars, noting their unswerving paths, their altitude rendering them almost immune to the heavy anti-aircraft fire below. Richter's operational logs from early 1944 consistently recorded no engagement for these high-flying formations, or at most, a perfunctory volley of ranging shots that blossomed harmlessly miles from their intended targets. The doctrine was clear. Focus on immediate, identifiable threats. This meant low-flying reconnaissance aircraft or the occasional British Mosquito probing coastal defenses. The distant dots were an academic concern, a statistical entry in intelligence reports, not a tactical priority. The 8.8-centimeter Flak 36, a dual-purpose weapon, was capable of an impressive muzzle velocity of 820 meters per second, and its shell could reach an effective ceiling of 10,600 meters. However, the American heavy bombers frequently operated above 8,000 meters, often pushing 9,000 meters, where the air was thin and the Flak 36's projectile velocity had significantly diminished. The probability of a direct hit at such ranges, even with radar-assisted targeting, was infinitesimally small, and the expenditure of a 15-kilogram high-explosive round for such a remote possibility was deemed wasteful. Production statistics from the Krupp Works showed that by early 1944, over 15,000 Flak 36 and 37 variants had been manufactured, forming the backbone of Germany's anti-aircraft defenses. Yet, even with this impressive industrial output, ammunition remained a critical concern, particularly as the Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Each round fired was a resource consumed, a small but tangible drain on the war economy, and Richter's directive to ignore the high-altitude specks was a direct reflection of this broader strategic imperative. The distant dots were not ignored out of complacency, but out of a calculated, if ultimately flawed, rationale of resource allocation. The P-47 pilots, initially tasked with high-altitude escort and air superiority, began to notice a peculiar phenomenon during their return flights. After engagements, with fuel tanks nearing depletion and ordnance expended, some pilots would experiment with steep descents, often from 25,000 feet or higher. These dives, initially a means to quickly lose altitude for landing, revealed an unexpected characteristic of the Thunderbolt. As the heavy fighter plunged earthward, its airspeed indicator would climb rapidly, often exceeding 500 miles per hour, a speed rarely achieved in level flight. The airframe, designed for extreme stresses, remained remarkably stable, resisting the buffeting and control surface flutter that might incapacitate lighter aircraft. This inherent structural integrity, a consequence of its robust construction and thick wing sections, allowed the P-47 to maintain control authority even at speeds approaching its theoretical maximum. Damage reports from early 1943, compiled by the 8th Air Force, occasionally noted P-47s returning with minor skin wrinkling or rivets popped from excessive G-loads, but never catastrophic structural failure during these high-speed dives. The aircraft's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower radial powerhouse, provided ample thrust for recovery, but it was the aerodynamic profile and sheer mass of the Thunderbolt that truly facilitated these descents. Weighing over 10,000 pounds empty, the P-47 possessed a ballistic coefficient that transformed gravity into a formidable accelerant. Unit diaries from fighter groups like the 56th and 78th, reviewed in post-mission debriefings, increasingly mentioned these gravity-assisted speeds, not as a tactic, but as an observed characteristic. The pilots, accustomed to the aircraft's often criticized climb rate, found a new appreciation for its ability to accelerate downward with such unwavering stability. This discovery was not a planned operational doctrine, but an emergent property of the aircraft, revealed through the iterative process of combat flight and pilot experimentation. The implication was subtle but profound. If the P-47 could achieve such speeds and maintain control during a dive, it possessed a kinetic energy advantage that might be exploited. The aircraft's perceived limitations in maneuverability at lower altitudes might be offset by an ability to arrive on target with unprecedented velocity, a trait that had not been fully appreciated in its initial design parameters. The sky for the Thunderbolt was not merely a medium for flight, but a reservoir of potential energy. American pilots, frustrated by the imprecision of their early bombing runs, began to adjust their tactics. They recognized that the P-47's robust airframe, designed for high-altitude combat and capable of absorbing significant battle damage, also offered an unexpected advantage in ground attack. Its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, generating over 2,000 horsepower, allowed for rapid acceleration and recovery from steep dives, a critical factor in mitigating vulnerability to ground fire. Initial experiments involved shallow-angle strafing passes, but these proved largely ineffective against hardened targets and exposed the aircraft to prolonged periods within the enemy's engagement envelope. Damage reports from early 1944, compiled by 8th Air Force Intelligence, indicated a disproportionately high rate of flak hits during these extended low-altitude attacks. The pilots sought a method that combined speed, surprise, and a reduced exposure time. This search led to the development of the dive bombing technique, adapted from earlier naval aviation practices, but applied to a fighter aircraft. The P-47, with its substantial weight and structural integrity, could withstand the stresses of a near-vertical descent. Pilots would climb to altitudes exceeding 10,000 feet, then pitch the aircraft into a dive, often at angles approaching 70 degrees, accelerating to speeds well over 400 miles per hour. The precision of this method stemmed from the direct line of sight established during the dive. As the aircraft plunged towards its target, the pilot could visually track the impact point with greater accuracy than during a level bombing run. The release of a 500-pound General Purpose bomb at the apex of the pullout, typically between 2,000 and 3,000 feet, allowed for a relatively flat trajectory in the final moments, maximizing kinetic energy and reducing deflection from wind. The introduction of the M10 triple-tube rocket launcher, carrying 4.5-inch M8 rockets, further refined this approach. These rockets, initially developed for anti-aircraft suppression, found a new role as ground attack munitions. A P-47 could carry up to 10 such rockets, 5 under each wing, adding a significant punch to its ordnance load. The rocket's trajectory, when launched from a high-speed dive, was less susceptible to wind drift than a free-falling bomb, offering another layer of precision. A pilot would aim the aircraft directly at the target, fire the rockets, and then immediately initiate a sharp pullout. using the P-47's formidable engine power to regain altitude and escape the immediate blast radius and concentrated flak. This combined tactic, a rapid descent followed by a swift ascent, dramatically reduced the time the aircraft spent in the most vulnerable zones. The problem of engaging hardened ground targets from the air had long vexed air forces, a challenge particularly acute against well-dug-in fortifications or armored vehicles. Machine gun fire, even from heavy-caliber weapons, often proved insufficient, its kinetic energy dissipating rapidly against steel and concrete. The bomb, while potent, demanded precise delivery from altitude, often requiring multiple passes and exposing the aircraft to sustained anti-aircraft fire. A gap existed between the light strike of a machine gun and the blunt force of a bomb, a need for a directed, explosive impact at closer ranges. Early attempts at rocket-propelled munitions for aircraft had been rudimentary, often little more than modified artillery rockets strapped to wings, their accuracy and stability highly suspect. The Germans, for instance, had experimented with the R-4M rocket, primarily an air-to-air weapon, but its application against ground targets was limited by its small warhead and high-velocity trajectory. The British, too, had developed air-to-surface rockets for naval targets, but these were heavy, cumbersome, and not ideally suited for the agile dive-bombing maneuvers required for ground attack. American engineers, examining the limitations of existing ordnance, turned their attention to a simpler, more robust design, leveraging existing rocket motor technology. The High-Velocity Aircraft Rocket, or HVAR, began its design phase in 1943, aiming for a weapon that combined the destructive power of a small bomb with the direct trajectory of a shell. Its core was a 5-inch diameter motor, initially derived from naval anti-submarine rockets, but adapted for aerial deployment. The motor burned for approximately 1.5 seconds, accelerating the rocket to over 1,375 feet per second. The warhead, a crucial component, was a 24-pound high-explosive charge designed to detonate on impact, creating a powerful blast and fragmentation effect. This was significantly more potent than a .50 caliber machine gun round, which delivered approximately 15,000 foot-pounds of energy, compared to the HVAR's explosive yield equivalent to a 100-pound general-purpose bomb. The fin stabilization system, a set of 4 canted fins, imparted a slow spin to the rocket during flight, enhancing its accuracy and preventing tumbling. Production of the HVAR ramped up rapidly, with manufacturing facilities across the United States, including those operated by General Electric and Westinghouse, churning out hundreds of thousands of units. By mid-1944, monthly output exceeded 40,000 rockets, a testament to its simplified design and the urgent demand for effective ground attack weapons. The rocket's relatively low cost, estimated at around $50 per unit, made it an economically viable option for mass deployment, contrasting sharply with the more complex and expensive guided munitions then under development. The operational deployment of the HVAR on aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt fundamentally altered the calculus of close air support. A single P-47 could carry up to 10 HVARs mounted on underwing pylons, delivering a concentrated barrage of explosive power. This allowed pilots to engage targets with a devastating punch from a relatively safe distance, often outside the effective range of light anti-aircraft guns. The psychological impact on ground troops facing a sudden volley of high-explosive rockets was often as significant as the physical destruction. The ability to deliver such concentrated firepower without the need for a precise dive-bombing run or the vulnerability of a low-level strafing pass offered a distinct tactical advantage. Pilots could approach targets at a shallower angle, launch their rockets, and then quickly disengage, minimizing their exposure to ground fire. This new weapon provided a tangible answer to the persistent challenge of overcoming entrenched positions and armored resistance from the air. Northern France, late 1944. The P-47 Thunderbolt, long a familiar sight to German ground crews, was now exhibiting a new, terrifying behavior. Its characteristic high-altitude dive, a maneuver perfected for energy retention and speed, was no longer solely culminating in strafing runs or bomb releases. Instead, a new weapon was emerging from its wing pylons, transforming the fighter-bomber into a precision artillery piece. The M8 rocket, a 4.5-inch unguided munition, had initially been a somewhat unreliable addition to the P-47's arsenal. Early versions suffered from poor accuracy, their fins often deforming under the stresses of flight, leading to wild trajectories. However, persistent engineering refinements, particularly improvements in fin stabilization and the introduction of zero-length launchers, dramatically improved their consistency. These launchers, essentially short rails that allowed the rocket to accelerate fully before separating from the aircraft, minimized the initial wobble that plagued earlier designs. Each P-47 could carry up to 10 M8 rockets, 5 beneath each wing, augmenting its formidable array of 8.50 caliber machine guns. The destructive potential of a single rocket carrying a 4.2-pound high-explosive warhead was comparable to a 75mm artillery shell. When a flight of 4 Thunderbolts, a common operational unit, unleashed their full complement of 40 rockets, the impact on a concentrated target area was devastating, far exceeding the localized effect of strafing or even small bombs. German anti-aircraft gunners, accustomed to the predictable arcs of artillery and the relatively slow descent of bombs, were ill-prepared for the speed and trajectory of rocket attacks. The P-47's dive, often initiated from altitudes exceeding 15,000 feet, allowed it to build immense speed approaching 500 miles per hour in the terminal phase. This velocity, combined with the rocket's own propulsion, meant the projectiles arrived with little warning, their brief flight time offering scant opportunity for defensive fire. The visual signature of these attacks was also deceptive. From the ground, the P-47s would appear as small, high-flying dots, indistinguishable from reconnaissance aircraft or fighters on patrol. The release of the rockets, often occurring at several thousand feet, was difficult to discern against the vastness of the sky. By the time the characteristic smoke trails became visible, the rockets were already well on their way, plummeting towards their targets with an unnerving inevitability. This convergence of high-speed delivery and potent, concentrated firepower created a psychological as well as physical shock. German command reports began to detail the effectiveness of these rocket-firing fighters, noting their particular lethality against armored vehicles, troop concentrations, and fortified positions. The sheer volume of fire, delivered with such speed, overwhelmed defensive responses and instilled a new dread among ground personnel. The low dots in the sky were no longer merely a nuisance. They were harbingers of sudden, violent destruction. Occupied France, August 1944. A German flak battery positioned to guard a vital crossroads near Falaise maintained its vigilant watch. Their 88mm guns, formidable instruments of aerial denial, were traversed to cover the high-altitude approaches. Their crews trained to identify the familiar silhouettes of Allied bombers. The low-flying, indistinct specks that occasionally flitted across the distant horizon were largely dismissed. Persistent nuisance, but rarely a direct threat, too fast and too low for the heavy flak to effectively engage, and seemingly too insignificant to warrant sustained attention. This tactical doctrine, forged in the early years of the war against high-flying formations, would soon prove a catastrophic miscalculation as the ground war intensified and the skies above the Normandy front became a new kind of hunting ground. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially conceived as a high-altitude interceptor, had undergone a significant operational evolution since its deployment. Its robust airframe, powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, delivering over 2,000 horsepower, allowed it to absorb considerable battle damage and return to base. While its 8.50 caliber machine guns were potent, the introduction of underwing pylons capable of carrying high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, transformed it into a devastating ground attack platform. Each HVAR, a 5-inch diameter projectile weighing 134 pounds, carried a 24-pound high-explosive warhead, capable of penetrating several inches of armor or creating a significant blast effect against soft targets. Unit after-action reports from late July and early August 1944, compiled from the 9th Air Force, documented a dramatic increase in rocket-equipped P-47 sorties. The average P-47 mission, carrying rockets, typically mounted 6 to 10 HVARs, often supplemented by 500-pound bombs. This payload, delivered in a dive at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, allowed pilots to release their ordnance with precision, often from altitudes below 2,000 feet, catching ground defenses completely by surprise. The relatively low trajectory and rapid deployment of these attacks meant that by the time the distinctive white smoke trails of the rockets were observed, impact was often seconds away. The strategic shift towards ground attack was a direct response to the static nature of the Normandy front and the urgent need to neutralize German armor and logistics. The sheer volume of P-47s available, with production figures exceeding 15,000 units by August 1944, allowed for continuous air support operations. This saturation tactic, combined with the psychological impact of sudden, violent rocket strikes, began to erode German morale and operational capacity. The German High Command, in communiques dated August 10th, began to specifically reference the rocket-firing fighter-bombers as a significant threat, noting their effectiveness against troop concentrations and supply convoys, a marked departure from earlier assessments. The German flak crews, accustomed to engaging targets at several thousand meters, found their training and equipment ill-suited for this new threat. The 88mm guns, with their relatively slow traverse and elevation rates, struggled to track aircraft moving at such speed and low altitude. Even the lighter 20mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns, designed for close-range defense, often found themselves outmaneuvered or suppressed by the P-47's machine gun fire during their attack runs. The low dots, once dismissed, now descended with a terrifying, explosive finality, transforming quiet rural roads into scenes of sudden, devastating destruction. The scattered reports from observation posts, initially dismissed as anomalies, began to coalesce into a pattern. Gunners, trained to identify the distinct silhouettes of bombers and the agile forms of fighter sweeps, had consistently underestimated the approaching dots, often logging them as distant, non-threatening specks on the horizon. This perceptual bias, ingrained through years of doctrine focused on high-altitude threats, left a critical blind spot in their defensive posture. Analysis of damaged equipment, particularly the shattered remnants of armored vehicles and locomotive engines, revealed a consistent point of impact. The projectiles were not striking from above in the typical dive-bombing fashion, nor were they approaching from the flanks as strafing runs often did. Instead, the damage indicated a flat trajectory, almost parallel to the ground in the moments before impact, suggesting an attack profile far lower than anticipated for conventional fighter bombers. Interrogation files from captured pilots, combined with recovered fragments of ordnance, provided the crucial technical insight. The rockets, specifically the M8 triple cluster rocket, were designed for low-altitude release, carrying a 4.5-inch high-explosive warhead. Production logs from American factories indicated a rapid escalation in M8 output, with over 2.5 million units manufactured by late 1944, dwarfing the production of earlier, less effective air-to-ground munitions. This sheer volume, coupled with the P-47's robust airframe, transformed the Thunderbolt from a pure fighter into a potent ground attack platform. The strategic implication was profound. German command had allocated significant anti-aircraft resources to defend against high-altitude bomber formations and medium-altitude fighter incursions, leaving their ground targets dangerously exposed to these low-flying, fast-moving rocket attacks. The P-47s, often flying below the effective engagement altitude of many German flak batteries, could approach with relative impunity, unleashing their devastating payloads before the ground crews could react effectively. This realization, slow in its dawning, fundamentally altered the perception of air superiority. It was no longer solely about control of the high skies, but also about the vulnerability of the ground below, a vulnerability exploited by an enemy who had adapted their tactics to the blind spots of their adversary. The dots, once ignored, now heralded destruction. Occupied France, August 1943. The flak gunners of the 2nd Flak Division, positioned near Le Mans, scanned the high heavens, their 88mm cannons elevating to track the distant, silver contrails of B-17 formations. Their training, honed over years of defending against high-altitude bombers, emphasized the threat from above, the precise calculations required to intercept targets at 25,000 feet. The lower airspace, below 5,000 feet, was generally considered the domain of reconnaissance aircraft or opportunistic strafing runs, nuisances to be dealt with by smaller caliber weapons, but rarely a primary threat demanding the full attention of heavy anti-aircraft batteries. This ingrained doctrine, a product of early war aerial engagements, would prove catastrophically inadequate as the nature of air combat shifted. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially conceived as a high-altitude escort fighter, found its true calling as a ground attack platform, a role for which its robust airframe and powerful engine were unexpectedly suited. Early missions, primarily escorting bombers, demonstrated its resilience, but its true potential emerged in the spring of 1944. Pilots, frustrated by the lack of aerial targets, began to experiment with strafing and dive bombing attacks against ground installations. The sheer weight of the aircraft, combined with its 9-ton maximum takeoff weight, allowed it to absorb significant damage and carry a formidable ordnance load, far exceeding the capabilities of lighter fighters. This evolution in tactics was not a centralized directive, but rather an organic development born of operational necessity and pilot initiative. Reports from returning pilots, detailed in 9th Air Force after-action summaries, increasingly highlighted successful attacks on trains, convoys, and airfields. The P-47's 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing at a combined rate of 6,800 rounds per minute, could shred unarmored targets. But it was the introduction of air-to-ground rockets that truly transformed its destructive potential. The M8 rocket, a 4.5-inch projectile, was initially developed by the U.S. Army Air Forces as an experimental weapon. Its 4.5-pound high-explosive warhead, though small, delivered a concentrated blast effect, particularly effective against soft-skinned vehicles, troop concentrations, and unfortified structures. Each P-47 could carry up to 10 M8 rockets mounted on underwing racks, turning the fighter into a precision artillery piece. The velocity of the P-47 in a dive, often exceeding 400 miles per hour, imparted significant kinetic energy to the rockets, enhancing their penetrative power upon impact. The doctrine for deploying these rockets was still nascent, but pilots quickly discovered that a shallow dive, followed by a level run at extremely low altitude, maximized accuracy and minimized exposure to ground fire. This tactic, however, brought the aircraft directly into the blind spots of heavy flak batteries, whose optical rangefinders and predictors were optimized for high-angle engagements. A gunner's field of view, often obstructed by terrain or vegetation at low angles, coupled with the rapid apparent movement of a fast-approaching aircraft at treetop level, made tracking and targeting a P-47 in such an attack profile exceedingly difficult. The German flak network, while formidable, was a system designed for a different war. Its 88mm guns, with their 35,000-foot ceiling and sophisticated fire control, were devastating against high-altitude bombers. However, their traverse and elevation speeds, while adequate for distant, slow-moving targets, were often insufficient to track a P-47 screaming across the landscape at 200 feet. The smaller caliber 20mm and 37mm guns, designed for low-altitude defense, lacked the destructive power to reliably bring down a heavily armored P-47 with a single hit, often requiring multiple impacts to inflict critical damage. Intelligence reports, gleaned from captured German document, and interrogation files, revealed a growing frustration among German ground commanders regarding the P-47's low-level attacks. A 1944 Wehrmacht situation report from the Western Front noted an alarming increase in successful fighter-bomber attacks on rail lines and motor transport, attributing significant losses to unforeseen low-level tactics. The report specifically mentioned the difficulty in engaging these aircraft with existing anti-aircraft assets, recommending the urgent deployment of more mobile, rapid-firing light flak units to forward areas. The strategic implication was profound. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies had waned significantly by mid-1944, leaving ground forces increasingly exposed. The P-47, operating with near impunity at low altitudes, began to systematically dismantle German logistical networks, isolating frontline units and disrupting reinforcements. The cumulative effect of these attacks, detailed in Allied damage assessments, showed a 60% reduction in daily rail traffic in some sectors of France following sustained P-47 operations. The sight of a single P-47 appearing suddenly over a ridge, a cluster of rockets trailing smoke, became a common and terrifying spectacle for German ground troops. The loud, distinctive roar of its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine, often the only warning, was invariably followed by the thunderous impact of rockets or the tearing sound of 50 caliber rounds.